Joyce Carol Oates is the author of many books and has penned many best-selling novels, critically acclaimed collections of short fiction, as well as essays, plays, poetry, and a memoir, and an unlikely bestseller on boxing. In 2010, reflecting on the widespread esteem in which her work is held, President Obama awarded Oates the National Humanities Medal. Best known for her fiction, Oates' novels include Them, which won the National Book Award, Blonde, a bold reimagining of the inner life of Marilyn Monroe, and We Were the Mulvaneys, which became a bestseller after being selected by Oprah's Book Club. Her books for 22 are Extenuating Circumstances, which received a star review from Publishers Weekly, and Babysitter. In 2023, she will release 48 Cues into the Disappearance of My Sister. She was also working on a novel called The Butcher. Since 1963, over 40 of Oates' books have been included in the New York Times list of notable books of the year. She is the Roger S. Berlind Distinguished Professor of the Humanities at Princeton University, and since 1978, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Joyce Carol Oates. And Vincent Valdez is recognized for his monumental portrayal of the contemporary figure. He's drawn and painted subjects remark on a universal struggle within in various socio-political arenas and eras. Valdez was born in 1977 in San Antonio, Texas. He received a full scholarship to study at the Rhode Island School of Design, where he earned his BFA in 2000. His exhibitions and collections include the Ford Foundation, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Mass MoCA, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the Smithsonian Museum of Art, and the National Portrait Gallery, among others. Valdez currently lives and works in Houston. So when we sort of teed up this conversation, the idea was that Joyce's classic work on boxing might be kind of a launch point for a discussion, where we could discuss a wide range of things. But sort of beginning with that, I was hoping that you could each tell us a little bit about to set the scene, a little bit about your personal connection to the sport, and what boxing has meant to you personally, why it's an area of interest for both of you as artists. And I was hoping you might go first, Joyce.
Well, thank you very much. It's delightful to be here in such an amazing place. This dyslexia is kind of interesting to me. And I'm wondering how many boxers may have been dyslexic. You know, it's like being left-handed. There's a different perspective that allows you to move through time and space in a way that's not really predictable by other people. Well, my interest in boxing really dates back to my father's interest. This was a long time ago when I was just a little girl. I was about 10, 11 years old, and my father took me to Golden Gloves amateur boxing matches in Buffalo, New York. He was also acquainted with a middleweight professional boxer, and so my father was of an era when boxing was very important in American culture. It has become since then somewhat marginalized, and that football and basketball have really taken kind of the center attention. But there was a time in our history when particularly the heavyweight boxing champion of the world would likely be American, and it would be a good deal of excited, like patriotic interest in who that heavyweight would be. So that was always kind of a very, very iconic position in the world of sports. And boxing had always seemed to me to be not exactly a sport, but something else more like gladiatorial combat in ancient Rome, let's say, where it's something that's not played at, like you play basketball, you play football, you play chess, but nobody plays boxing. It seems to be a very special kind of niche. So that was quite a while ago, and then when it came time for me to be writing about the 1950s, I was writing a story, and I always have a kind of dense sociological context to my novels. There's usually a family, and then there's some sort of political situation. And I thought I would write about boxing as part of the culture. So I started sort of remembering and recollecting the emotional connection with my father and with that lost world of my girlhood. So to make a really long story short, the world of my father was a masculine world. And when I went to these fights, so when I was brought there, I was in a completely masculinized world. But the air was blue with smoke, and everybody smoked in those days. There were very few women. Golden Gloves is amateur boxing, and the boxers could be teenagers. They're quite young. But to be almost no women there because mothers didn't want to see their sons get hurt. So it was a very masculine world. And then by contrast, my mother's world and my grandmother's world, they were the world of women. And the two worlds were kind of an interesting dramatic contrast. The excitement and kind of chaos and unpredictability and almost fearfulness of my father's world, and then a kind of predictable coziness and comfort, much associated with food and with knitting and quilting and making clothing, because they did a lot of that. So it's like the homemaker's world of domestic life, which is very comforting and feminine, and then the masculine world, which basically anything could happen. It could be very ugly. It could be very scary. But it wasn't going to be bland. It was the antithesis of the other world.
You know, for me, I remember growing up in the south side of San Antonio, Texas, and I noticed very early on how there was situated within the communities, right, the barrios, really, in the south side, the west side, and then in the black community, in the east side, so brown and black communities, gyms, and every few blocks, right, these boxing gyms. And these young boys always lined up inside of these gyms late into the evenings as we'd pass by, driving by in the car. I was always really interested in that, but never really understood at that early of an age yet. So fast forward a little bit, I remember being about 10 years old and then watching on the screen this young character named Mike Tyson, right? And I remember being struck by not only the build of this character, the menacing face, right? But there was something that really struck a chord with me, and I remember it was sort of the entire spectacle on that unfolding on that screen. In this one fight, he's walking down the aisle into the ring, and they're blasting on HBO, on loudspeakers, Public Enemy, a song from Public Enemy. And that's sort of when it connected for me, this idea that this event, right, is the golden ticket. It's an event that sort of reveals a much larger symptom or condition about society in America. When I'm at RISD as a student, I had the really stupid, brilliant idea of joining a boxing club. I had no business doing this thing. I mean, I had no experience. And I got talked into it by somebody else, and I show up, and I was really drawn to the energy of not trying to figure out how to develop boxing skills, but it was always for me trying to figure out how the hell I was going to walk out and survive this match. Exactly, my weight, I was a mosquito weight, right? And so I remember there was no divisions, weight divisions, and so I was going up against these big guys, and after about 3 or 4 matches, I remember going back into the studio at RISD and saying, it's probably not a good idea to risk damaging my hands or eyes, so what else can I do? And that's when it all sort of came together for me. And I immediately ran to the drawing board, and I produced my first boxing image, and I invented this character that was in many ways autobiographical, and his name was El Pollo, the Great Chicken, right? And it was the idea of inventing this so-called narrative about survival and what that meant in 21st century America.
Thank you. You, Vincent, you also mentioned to me when we talked about unboxing specifically that sort of how you came to read the book. Can you just recount that briefly?
Sure. So a few years later, I'm out of school and I'm in the studio working. This is about 2002. And I was developing my first serious body of work titled Stations. It was for my first museum show, and I was about halfway through the process in the studio, and I remember walking into the studio one day, and at the door, somebody had placed a book at my doorstep. And I picked up the book, and it read Unboxing by Joyce Carol Oates. And I walked into the studio, sat on my dirty couch, and in front of all of these drawings, I read the entire book in a single day, because I remember stopping immediately within the first few pages, and I was convinced that Joyce had written this book about these drawings, right? It was such a beautiful fit, like a glove. And it really, I remember it really, it gave me that motivation because it ignited within me not only encouragement, but the validation of this is a story that has come before me, that has been told before me. And so now, I was 22, 23 years old, I was now entering this legacy, this lineage of not only American artists and thinkers, right, but about this idea of becoming an artist who was responding to the world.
And maybe just to get the full perspective before we move on, you mentioned, Joyce, that the book was written in the mid to late 80s, that most of the pieces were, that since then it has moved from the great American sport to something a little bit more marginalized. Can you sort of describe or just give us a sense of, when you look back on this period of boxing, where the book sort of sits within your body of work and how you think of it now?
Well, it's hard to answer that because when I look at unboxing now, I have one of the editions here. It's very much a sort of memoir, and that the connection that we have emotionally with sports is often part of our family situation. So many women who are involved at all with boxing, I think, came to it by way of a father or a spouse or a partner or a brother. I'm not sure that it's a sport that most women would go to immediately, whereas with men, it's more likely. And Vincent, you didn't come from a family where boxing was very important. You sort of discovered it by yourself.
Right.
Yeah. Well, when I was growing up, which is a long time ago, boxing, as I said, was very important. And all these neighborhoods in a fair-sized city, you would have the different neighborhoods, and they would have their gyms and their boxing, like their camps, so to speak, training gyms. And there would be ethnic identity was very important. So it isn't necessarily that there was racism or bigotry, but rather more like a neighborhoods, like the Irish here and the Italians, the blacks, the Hispanics. So it's like this seething, smoldering cauldron of energy, most of it like adolescent energy, like young male energy, just seething and kind of thrumming with excitement. So once or twice a week there would be these fights in the different neighborhoods, and everybody would go to see them. And it was like the passion that you feel for your local, like a high school football team or something. That kind of intense emotional identification. But you seem not to have had that.
We didn't. I mean, other than watching the big mega fights, at that time, 86, 1990.
Yeah. It's a little later.
Right.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until when I had come across your book while making that series of works that my grandfather had caught wind of this boxing series I was doing. And one day I was at his house, and he told me to wait right there, and he went into his room and came out and presented me with this aged yellow crumbling newspaper article, and that I still have. And it's just amazing. I really wish I would have had an image of it to provide tonight, but he was 17 years old, 105 pounds. He was on a ship on his way to Europe during World War II, and this photograph is the moment that an officer came in, plucked my grandfather and said, "We need somebody in the ring for this match on the ship. You're going in." And my grandfather explained to me how he tried to plea with the officer, I'm not a fighter.
Oh, that's awful.
And he said, "Get in there." And so this amazing photographer caught this moment in time. My grandfather's flying through the air, barefoot. Nobody told him that he was going up against the Golden Gloves champ.
Oh, no.
And
That's
so
awful.
my grandfather, I'll never forget the story. He said he remembers putting the mouthpiece in.
Oh.
He remembers hearing ding, ding. He turned around, and the next thing he knows, he's waking up in his bunk. And in that single blow, he lost all of his front teeth, broken jaw, and so his career ended. But I remember feeling so excited about him sharing this story with me, because I remember at that moment in time thinking, like, it's somehow inherent, right? Maybe this is where the interest somehow lies within me that, none of us knew the story. He never really spoke about it.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But it seems in retrospect it's sort of mildly entertaining, but actually that was really, really awful.
Oh, sure, of course. Of course.
That was unconscionable. He could have been concussed. He could have had brain damage. That's the sort of thing that went on all too often, where you have people from somewhat disadvantaged or disenfranchised part of our capitalist society, kind of plucked out and exploited in such a way, and he couldn't say no.
Right. It's against his own will.
Well, you're lucky that you're here. I mean, you're lucky that he. I mean, that is really, I would say that is actually shocking.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody who never even had any training.
And it was amazing, I think, to also remember how, at the same time, he was so proud of that,
Proud of
telling that
that,
story,
yeah.
right?
Because it's macho. It's the macho.
Exactly. We knew he always could move his teeth, but we never understood why. And then it all made sense. He had these dentures, right? Because he was missing teeth from way back then.
And he weighed 105 pounds.
105 pounds.
And his opponent was probably much, much heavier.
Sure.
What a terrible story. Congratulations on your lineage.
Well, in trying to tee up the conversation, one of the areas I tried to look at was just the overlap between each of your work, the areas of overlap, and one thing that came across to me in looking at Vincent's work is that, and then reading yours, is that this notion of the spectacle of the fight, and there's a part in Unboxing where you, Joyce, describe the boxing ring as an altar, where the laws are suspended, where a person cannot legally be murdered, but they might die at the hands of their opponent, and so it's an area where we condone and celebrate violence in this very contained way, and it occurred to me that what you're describing is essentially a sacred and profane kind of space. And when I look at Vincent's work, so much of that is on display, particularly in stations. And I was wondering, is it fair to say that you're playing with those concepts in the work we see here in stations?
Sure. So in a series like Stations, it was evident in the title itself that I was patterning it or echoing a historic tale like Stations of the Cross, right? And so I remember as a kid growing up Catholic, sitting in the backs of the church pews during a mass, and I was always intrigued by these visuals that were on the wall, these plates, right, of the Stations of the Cross. They were like the ultimate dramatic soap opera unfolding, right? The cinematic quality, the violence, the drama, the despair. And so it really was the way that I learned how to draw the human figure, because I would make these studies during the length of the Mass. And so creating a series like Stations, I was never interested in the subject matter solely about religion, right, or about a tale of Jesus Christ. I was more trying to figure out a way to reveal a larger, broader context about a universal tale that has been told throughout world history and civilization over and over again. This idea of archetypal notions about masculinity. And so in a series of 17 large-scale charcoal drawings, I create this fictional character very much like a movie director would, right? And so my younger brother becomes the main actor. Every face in these scenes are friends and family who came in the studio, were staged with lighting by myself, and then I would invent these images on large sheets of paper. Like the tale of the Stations of the Cross, here is this David staring at his Goliath for the first time, right? The fix is in, and he knows it. But the idea, the messaging about whether or not he will or will not get back up to endure, in many ways, the self-torture, right? I think for me, is the catalyst behind a series like this, and so again, like reading a book like Joyce's, I really felt that even back then, they really worked hand in hand together, and she had this language, this way of articulating what I couldn't do with words, but was trying to do with images.
Does that resonate with you?
Oh, it's fascinating to hear. Well, I think that we have to designate between boxing and fighting. So fighting is some sort of a very natural, instinctive, and impulsive way of defending oneself, or maybe it's aggressive. But boxing is actually different. And boxing emerges out of fighting. It's obviously some of the same energies, but in some ways boxing is very unnatural. See, a normal person, I mean, most of us are normal. A normal person, if we're hit hard and knocked down, we really don't want to get up again and get hit again. So the young boxer has to be taught that when he's hit and hurt and knocked down, he's got to get up again. It's like if you're riding a horse and you're thrown from your horse, you've got to get right up and get back on the horse, I've been told. I've never had that experience, and I'm not sure that I would be a person who would get back on. But so boxing is a civilized form of fighting. In a sense, it's very much, it's regulated with rules and all sorts of history. There are 3 people involved, and there's not just 2 people, but the third man in the ring makes it a sort of a civilized ritual rather than just something blunt and primitive. And when you talk, I think it's a wonderful metaphor to talk about the stations, because I'm sure, and particularly in the old long boxing matches, which could be as many as 100 rounds, can you believe it? 70 rounds, 50 rounds. Now we have 12 rounds, maybe even 15 once in a while. But you know, it's a very different sport today. I don't want to say it's sanitized because it's still brutal, but it's nothing like what it used to be. I mean, it's just beyond any imagination. 100 rounds, sometimes in the hot sun, and the men were just out there trying to kill one another. But the notion that it's primitive or it's, you know, haphazard, that's not really what boxing is. Boxing is a whole history and legacy of all kinds of customs and rituals and enormous respect for its history. That's one of the reasons I was drawn to write about it. I don't think there's any other sport that has such extraordinary respect and interest in its own history, where the old great champions of yesteryear are somehow sort of contemporaneous with the younger boxers. When Mike Tyson was being trained by Customato, Mike Tyson was not an orphan, but he had been in a reform school, and he was sort of like an orphan, and Customato was sort of like a father, a paternal figure. They would spend their evenings in Catskill, New York, after a day of training and working with sparring partners. They would spend their evenings watching the old films, going back to Jack Johnson, as far back as there were films. They would sit and watch these, most of them no longer living great boxers. So it's a sport that exists in the present tense, but even maybe more importantly, it's got this long, long history. And as I said, it's a very masculine sort of warrior ethic, that you are up against a foe whose strengths are your weakness. In other words, it isn't that you're weak or that you're strong, it's only in terms of the opponent. So when you have stations, it's almost like that lone figure is contending with himself. It's like the Christ figure on the cross is very alone. And we have that iconic and beautiful but tragic image of the lone, like the spiritual crisis of individuals. And that's what you're kind of giving body to.
Right, and I really love that you consistently remark about the presence of the referee in the ring, right? Probably the figure that's often seen as least important and many times just kind of in the way. But in a series like Stations, for me, he was such a pivotal role because I was thinking about the referee as representation for institution, right? Order, power structures, right? And then the audience, the audience in a series of drawings like this was played as a more important role than the actual main characters themselves. The audience became these powerful representations for me as the artist, as society, right? The need for these sort of modern day Frankenstein characters, creations of a society, products of a society, only to be discarded by society. These notions about who warriors are, why we need them, what role they serve throughout world history, and in modern day society. I mean, for me, it really was about trying to, the representation of the boxer as a figure in drawing and painting has been my longest standing subject over 20 plus years. I don't think it's something that I'll ever truly abandon because there's so much to dissect about it. Especially as the years go on, it evolves, the subject evolves into something else, it morphs into something else for me, and I think that I'm really curious about how, actually one thing that I wanted to mention was I really also appreciate that you refer back to the sort of golden age of American boxing. One of the things that I would do in the studio by myself was I had bought myself an old Super 8mm projector, and I would collect these reels of old boxing films, and I would sit there and to hear that click, 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 click sound and watch the small black and white screens. There's something so beautiful and cinematically about the fast-moving motions of these animated characters, and sequences unfolding, and that was really something I tried to capture. So when you see an image of the boxer laid out in one of the final scenes of the series on that table back in his locker room, you, the viewer, get to decide, is he passed away, right? Is he daydreaming about his next fight? And if you look closely on that tattered, worn out, sweaty wall behind him, that's exactly what Joyce is describing. There's these posters of all the legends that have come before him, the legacy of these fighters whose shoes he desperately still wants to fill.
Well, I want to stay, close to each of your art forms, but when we talk about this lone, solitary fighter who's either kind of a victor or a tragic figure, I always think of Tyson. And I just learned today in reading your Substack material that you were one of the first people to interview Tyson for a significant magazine, and you visited him in Catskill. What do you make of the trajectory of his career as both kind of I'll let you
Well,
finish.
it's so interesting that you first saw Mike Tyson. Do you remember which fight that was? Was it Trevor Berbick?
I think it's the very first
That was the very
championship fight.
first, yeah. Well, that was so exciting because he was the youngest he became the youngest heavyweight champion in history. And that particular fight was the one that I covered, quote unquote, for Life magazine. So I was there like at ringside, and I was with all these male journalists, and I was sort of sitting there. I had never covered a fight before. I think I had never seen a professional fight before in my life. I'd just seen the Golden Gloves fights. And amateur boxing is totally different from professional boxing. So when you mention, this kind of iconic figure coming in and the music, and he's got the black trunks on and the black shoes and no socks, and he's got this like a death's head face, all that is so emotionally evocative to me, because that was like the beginning of my whole career in writing about boxing, so to speak. So I was there, and as you say, it was very thrilling in a theatrical way, and all of Mike's fights were like that. Mike Tyson was very carefully and very deftly choreographed. His career was very careful. When young boxers are coming along in different parts of the country, there are the really good young boxers coming along, and people sort of know ahead of time he might be a champion. Those young boxers don't fight one another. No, because you don't want any one of them to get knocked out. They're going to make a lot of money eventually. Eventually they'll fight one another, but not for quite a while. So his career was carefully managed, and I love this story, and I won't talk too much longer because I don't want to I could talk forever about this. But there's this wonderful story. Customato had been a legendary trainer already, and he was probably in his 70s, and he was sort of looking around for his next champion. Floyd Patterson had been his most recent champion, and he was living in Catskill, New York, and he devoted some of his time pro bono to the local a boxing gym, and there boys from a reform, juvenile detention, bad boys. I mean, these were bad boys. They wouldn't just give them a slap on the wrist and sent home. They were put in an institution. So these boys, some of them would come over from the reform school to the gym, and Customato and his assistants would kind of work with them. And one day, Customato said, I looked up, and there he came in, 12 years old. I thought, that's the next heavyweight champion of the world. It was Mike Tyson. Isn't that an amazing story? So Customato, that evening, he telephoned his friend and manager, Jimmy Jacobs, who with Bill Clayton owned this franchise, Big Fights Incorporated. And he said to Jimmy, I just met the next heavyweight champion of the world today. He came into my boxing gym. He's 12 years old. And Jimmy said, say no more. I'm investing in him. That is how fast that happened. A wonderful story. And they were right. Yeah. And Jimmy Jacobs and Customato and Bill Clayton, they very carefully guided his career. And his career did start to plummet and plunge and deteriorate after Cuss died, and then Jimmy Jacobs died. And then Don King moved in. And then Robin Gibbons and all these people who didn't love Mike Tyson the way the others had loved him.
Did you ever attend any other pro fights after that?
Oh yes, I covered a number of fights of Mike Tyson's, yeah. Spinks and Bone Crusher Smith, and somebody else, yes, I did. Atlantic City and back in Las Vegas, yeah.
My first pro fight was a young Manny Pacquiao in San Antonio, early 90s, and I remember paying more attention to what was happening in the crowd because there was more fights in the crowd than there were in the action in the ring, because the importance of in some ways like the weight of national identity that plays into these matches, right, is everything. So at that time it was Filipino versus Mexicans, and it was, just that entire environment and atmosphere,
Yeah.
right?
It used to be very volatile. It's probably policed a little more.
Yeah.
The first time I went to Madison Square Garden was quite a while ago, and that was before, I guess, some sort of restraining laws, but they would throw their beer bottles, like, just, if they're angry about something, they would throw them at the ring, and food and all sorts of things, and the air is blue with smoke, as I said before. It's such a harsh, masculine atmosphere that many men today, I don't think, could even deal with it. Just the smoke alone. Oh. Imagine they were fighting in all this smoke.
Oh, yeah. With the cigarette still in their mouths.
Crazy, just crazy.
Well, so this will be my last question. There's there's a moment in unboxing where you describe Michael Spinks winning this Olympic gold medal and then going back to work in a chemical factory, and then returning to boxing again, feeling like he was safer in the ring. It occurs to me that much of your work, well, both of your work, plays with this fine line between sort of fame and desperation. And I wondered if there was any common ground in that. I think of your work in Blonde, for example, in that way. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, this is absolutely very much an analog. There's a quote from Sartre, which is one of the epigraphs to my novel Blonde, and Sartre says, "Genius is the way one acts in desperate circumstances." So you're kind of trapped, maybe economically, not going to college the way people tend to do today. Almost everybody goes to college or could go to a community college if they wanted to today. That wasn't the case in the past. It was most unusual for many people in certain parts of the country to graduate from high school. Most people, or many people of a certain economic level, they quit school about 6th or 8th grade and they went out and worked. You would be like one of 9 children in your family, like Jack Dempsey, or somebody like Joe Louis who had to go out and do that. And I think that the other way of looking at it, which is not necessarily the way we've been talking about it, is to look upon the boxers as victims of a society that doesn't care for people on the margin and sort of throws them to compete with one another. And when they're hurt, which was all the time, toss them away and just ignore them and forget about them. I don't know what it's like now with boxing, and I haven't been following women's boxing, but there was a long time, and maybe it's still now, when the women boxers were very badly treated. They were not paid well, and if they were hurt, they didn't have good medical attention, and they had no benefits and no insurance, and just nobody cared about them. So they put their life on the line to make, $100, and it could be like the end of your life. And we haven't talked about that, the exploitation of these young people. That's sort of like a whole other like a seminar.
Right. I mean, I think it's fair to say that America loves its tragic heroes, right?
Yes.
The tragic tale of the rise and then the fall of these individuals. And I think that, again, a subject like boxing for me encompasses perfectly the tale of the underdog, right? The underdog in America. I think, even from my own perspective, through my own lens as a Mexican American, understanding in a state like Texas, right, what it means to be considered an other. And for a long time, boxing was coined as the poor man's sport, right? It meant that it was the answer. It was that chance for reaching for a golden ticket. Joyce actually begins on boxing with this quote from Rocky Graziano. I just want to read it really quickly. And I remember opening this book 20-something years ago, and immediately, this is the very first thing you set your eyes on, is this quote. And I remember feeling at that moment, like, this is it. This makes absolute sense to me. It's a terrible sport, but it's a sport. The fight for survival is the fight,
Mm.
right? And that's perfectly stated.
Yeah.
Well, that feels like a nice place to conclude. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Joyce Carol Oates, Vincent Valdez. Thank you so much for taking the time.